The Subcommittee on Space and Aeronautics will come to order, please. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recesses of the subcommittee at any time. Welcome to today's hearing entitled Risks and Rewards, Encouraging Commercial Space Innovation while Maintaining Public Safety. I'd like to recognize myself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. Two of my highest priorities as chairman of the Space Subcommittee have been to ensure U.S. leadership in space exploration and to maintain a robust commercial space industry. These two priorities go hand in hand, and both have significant implications for our economic competitiveness and our national security. And that's also why this committee has worked tirelessly to streamline commercial space regulations over the last decade. Prior to Space Policy Directives 1, 2, and 3, this committee passed the Commercial Space Launch Competitiveness Act and the American Space Commerce Free Enterprise Act that sought to update and streamline all aspects of commercial space. Thankfully, the Trump administration continued the process with the aforementioned Space Policy Directives. But now we must review the implementation of those directives and codify necessary updates through legislation. The committee started this process last November with the passage of the Commercial Space Act out of committee. The importance of that legislation has become even more apparent since then. License processing under the new Part 450 process is moving at a snail's pace, while the administration seeks even more regulatory authority, all while our competitors continue to make significant progress. And I fear that at this rate, the Communist Party will launch taikonauts to the moon while U.S. industry remains tethered to Earth with red tape. Inefficiencies in our launch licensing process cause me great concern, as they compromise our competitiveness and security. And that is why today's hearing is so important. The FAA's Part 450 launch and reentry regulations were intended to expedite the licensing process and enable an increased cadence for launches. So far, FAA has issued 6 licenses under Part 450, with applications taking years to complete. Many applications for Part 450 licenses are still under review, impacting launch schedules and NASA missions. We've heard complaints about duplicative review processes between FAA and other government agencies, uncertain timelines, and the lack of definitive and specific implementation guidance. In this hearing, we look to understand the benefits and challenges of Part 450. We also hope to hear FAA's plans and timeline for much-needed improvement of Part 450 implementation, whether through additional reform efforts, rulemaking committees, additional advisory circulars, creation of a new electronic filing system, or other strategies to aid in application processing. Having an effective licensing system is critical to the future of our country's economic and national security. The United States leads in commercial space, but we cannot ever take that for granted. Under the increasing burden of regulatory compliance, companies may turn to more light-touch approvals available overseas. This is not hypothetical, and when the U.S. dragged its feet approving commercial remote sensing systems in the 1990s, the industry simply moved overseas. And now, with nations like China seeking to leapfrog our accomplishments in space, it is even more imperative that we streamline our processes, issue timely approvals, minimize regulatory burdens, and advance innovative space concepts. The national security implications posed by the FAA's regulations are very concerning, as our goal of returning humans to the moon could be unnecessarily delayed. For example, the human landing system that will take our astronauts to the lunar surface this decade, the many test missions needed before that, will require an FAA launch license. It is imperative that we are the first country back on the lunar surface so that we can establish norms of behavior and transparent practices that align with freedom rather than the CCP's autocracy. China routinely violates international norms right here on Earth, so I wouldn't be surprised if they attempted to place no trespassing signs on the moon. And that's why last fall, Chairman Lucas and I introduced H.R. 6131, the Commercial Space Act. This legislation would direct the Department of Commerce to issue certifications for novel space activities, allowing innovation to thrive while ensuring compliance with the United States' international obligations. This legislation also included provisions addressing the processes and systems that could enable more effective and efficient launch licensing while still maintaining public safety. I look forward to working with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle here to advance this legislation. I would welcome our esteemed panel of witnesses today. Thank you all for being here. Each of you bring decades of experience and a unique perspective to the topic of space activity licensing that will benefit this subcommittee's consideration of these very significant topics. So now I would like to recognize the ranking member for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Babin, for holding today's hearing entitled Risks and Rewards, Encouraging Commercial Space Innovation while Maintaining Public Safety. I also want to welcome our distinguished panel of witnesses today. Thank you for your time, your expertise, and for being here today. When you grow up with a dad who's an aerospace engineer who worked on the shuttle program, you'll learn a lot about what is in our infinite frontier. And now, as the ranking member of this subcommittee, it is our job to figure out how we make space a catalyst for inspiration as we work together to develop our STEM workforce, innovate, and then grow our economy. We rely on space systems and technologies to communicate, to navigate, monitor, and understand the Earth and our ever-changing climate, and perhaps most importantly, to discover and explore. Increasingly, space is also important to our national security. To realize the benefits of space, we need to access space and often return systems back to Earth. Launch and reentry services, largely provided by the commercial sector, are a gateway. Commercial launch and reentry services are essential to our civil, commercial, and national security activities in space. Back in 1984, through this committee's leadership, Congress granted the Secretary of Transportation the authority to license commercial launch systems consistent with public health, safety of property, national security, and foreign policy interests of the United States. The Secretary later delegated the authority to the Federal Aviation Administration. Congress has amended and updated the original statute as the industry has evolved. To date, the FAA has licensed over 700 commercial space launches that have occurred without any impact to public safety or significant impact to any public property. Mr. Chairman, that is an impressive safety record that we can all and we should be proud of. I want to thank the public servants at the FAA for their hard work, dedication, and commitment to maintaining safety. Of more than 700 licensed launches to date, 40% have occurred in just the last 3 years. With the increasing number of launches, it's important the FAA keep pace in its licensing and safety practices. But this is not an easy task because the FAA also transitions to updated launch and reentry regulations issued in 2020, navigates licenses for innovative systems and concepts of operation, and monitors the emerging commercial human spaceflight industry and the eventual need for a safety framework. Today's hearing provides an opportunity to consider how we support the FAA and the commercial space industry at large, responding to this period of tremendous growth. Are the new regulations meeting their intended goals? Do we have the necessary workforce, the necessary infrastructure, and resources to respond? Do we understand the implications of those activities on our environment? And are we prepared for accidents should those occur? I look forward to hearing from our witnesses on what this committee and Congress can do to sustain a safe, vibrant, and leading U.S. commercial space launch and reentry industry. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Sorensen. And now I'd like to recognize the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Lucas, for a statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In this Congress, a consistent theme of the committee's work has been to ensure U.S. competitiveness in science technology, including our nation's commercial space activities. This is particularly important as we examine space policy and consider how to continue leadership from the U.S. commercial space sector. To this end, we have considered the role of commercial entities play in the future of space exploration and how collaboration between government and industry can both further national space objectives and support the development of a space economy. Importantly, we've also considered how the federal government can authorize and supervise the activities of non-governmental entities without limiting innovation and technological achievements. In 2018, the Trump administration's Space Policy Directive No. 2, commonly known as SPD-2, triggered a government-wide review of the administrative framework applicable to space activities. SPD-2 directed agencies to streamline licensing processes and otherwise reduce the burden of regulatory compliance for space operators. 5 years have passed, and it's time to assess the effectiveness of these reform efforts. Today's hearing will review the licensing process for launch and reentry vehicles administered by the Department of Transportation via the Federal Aviation Administration. In 2020, FAA issued the Streamlining Launch and Reentry License Requirements Final Rule. This sought to establish a single licensing process that applied to all types of launch and reentry operations by replacing the existing prescriptive requirements with performance-based criteria. Now, 3 years since the rule went into effect, we seek to understand the impact of the new licensing process and the extent to which it accomplished the goals of SPD-2. We will consider progress in implementing the rule and identify areas which may benefit from further improvement. Beyond our review of the launch licensing, we also consider the approach behind the United States regulation of space activities of all kinds. How did the existing structures evolve over time? What lessons can be learned as we look to grant new authority over in-space activities? How have past efforts affected the pace of innovation? How do we continue to encourage commercial space activity moving forward? Last fall, this committee addressed many of these issues in the Commercial Space Act, sponsored by Chairman Babin. This legislation provided regulatory certainty to the American commercial space sector while streamlining the licensing process for launch and reentry. The morning that we marked that legislation up, the National Space Council unveiled, did I say the morning that we marked that legislation up? The National Space Council unveiled a legislative proposal for mission authorization that, while well-intended, created more burdens for our commercial space industry. This proposal would require commercial operators to go through a maze of regulatory agencies before launch, and creates a confusing process even for the most seasoned regulatory experts. This is why we must advance the Commercial Space Act and not wait for another Congress to act. I hope my colleagues will join me in moving forward this important legislation. And I thank our witnesses for joining us today. Each of our panelists bring a different perspective on these issues, and I look forward to hearing their thoughts. And with that, Mr. Chairman, thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I really appreciate it. And now I'd like to recognize the ranking member of the full committee for a statement. Ms. Law.
Well, I thank you, Chairman Babin and Ranking Member Sorensen, for holding today's hearing. We need to encourage commercial space innovation, but also we need to maintain public safety. And I want to welcome our panel of distinguished witnesses. I thank you for being here. You know, the U.S. commercial space industry is vibrant, it's growing, and this is good for our economy, and it's good for all of us who benefit from the many applications of space technologies and capabilities. The launch and reentry industry is a pillar of not only our commercial space industry, but also our civil and national security space programs. It is literally what gets us there. 4 years ago, as has been mentioned, the FAA's Office of Commercial Space Transportation issued new regulations that were intended to streamline the process of getting a launch or reentry license and enable greater innovation, flexibility, and efficiency. The implementation of these regulations and getting it right is one of the most pressing issues for the commercial space industry today. And I'm pleased, therefore, that we're discussing this important topic. We need a modern, commonplace regulatory system that can accommodate and enable the growing industry and its increasing pace of activity. It's no surprise that the cadence and complexity of launch operations and systems is adding significant strain to the system. In many ways, this is a good problem to have if we can ensure the necessary support and resources are available to manage it. Now, Congress, on a bipartisan basis, recognizes the need to better equip the FAA to support the growing commercial space industry. Even with a constrained budget environment, FAA's Office of Commercial Space Transportation has seen budget increases in recent years. Probably more increases are needed, in large part to allow FAA to hire the right people to handle the increasing workload. But as is so often the case, we are asking the agency to do a lot with a limited budget. My guess is, however, that budget increases alone are not enough to get us where we need to be. To that end, I'm eager to hear today from our witnesses about concrete, actionable solutions to ensure that the FAA Office of Commercial Space Transportation can more efficiently and effectively carry out its mission to regulate commercial space, launch, and reentry. But this must be consistent with the public health and safety of property, in addition, of course, to our national security and foreign policy interests. I look forward to the testimony today, and I thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Lofgren. Now I'd like to have the honor of introducing our witnesses. Our first witness today is Mr. Kelvin Coleman, who serves as the Associate Administrator for Commercial Space Transportation at the Federal Aviation Administration. In this role, he oversees the regulation of the commercial space industry as well as the development and implementation of FAA regulations. Prior to joining the FAA, Mr. Coleman served as a systems engineer for the U.S. Naval Air Systems Command. Our next witness is Mr. Dave Cavosa, who serves as the president of the Commercial Spaceflight Federation, or CSF, where he leads efforts to promote the development and maturation of the commercial space industry. Prior to joining CSF, Mr. Cavosa worked as the lead for U.S. government business at Agility Beyond Space and has served as the executive director and chair of the board at the Satellite Industry Association. Our third witness is Mr. Mike French, who founded and leads the Space Policy Group, which provides independent space policy analysis. He also serves as a senior advisor on space issues to BCG. Mr. French has also previously served as NASA's Chief of Staff. And our final witness is Ms. Pamela Meredith. Ms. Meredith serves as the chair of the Space Law Practice Group at KMA Zuckert, where she advises clients on subjects including FAA licensing. She also serves as an adjunct professor of satellite communications and space law at American University's Washington School of Law. I want to thank each and every one of you witnesses for being here today. And now I'd like to recognize Mr. Coleman for 5 minutes to present his testimony. Mr. Coleman?
Good morning, and thank you. Chair Lucas, Chair Babin, Ranking Member Lofgren, and Ranking Member Sorensen, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today to discuss the FAA Office of Commercial Space Transportation's ongoing efforts to streamline and improve our processes and regulatory framework to enable safe space transportation. Commercial space transportation operations are increasing in complexity, diversity, and frequency, creating a significant growth in demand for FAA licensing products and services. This year, we are on pace to exceed last year's operations by more than 30%. Over the course of our 40-year history, we have licensed or permitted more than 800 U.S. commercial space operations and have met our mission on every one. Safety is the FAA's North Star and is critical to the uninterrupted success of an industry that has become so vitally important to our nation. The law requires that we make new license determinations for accepted applications within a period of no more than 180 days, and we've hit that mark 98% of the time, averaging 151 days to issue a new license. Making timely licensing determinations requires a commitment from government as well as industry to be thorough, transparent, and efficient, always in ways that uphold public safety and meet regulatory requirements. The FAA recognizes the importance of regulatory certainty and has made it a top priority, ensuring our licensing requirements are understandable, achievable, and actionable. To facilitate industry licensing, we have offered office hours and workshops where industry can meet with us to ask questions and discuss issues, provided checklists and visual tutorials to aid in application development, issued advisory circulars to help shepherd compliance with regulatory requirements, and made investments in the development of new tools that will improve license application and processing efficiency. Industry bears the responsibility for demonstrating compliance with safety regulations and plays a significant role in helping the FAA reach licensing determinations faster. Navigation of the regulatory process cannot be an afterthought. Applications should speak directly to our requirements when first submitted. Thorough and complete applications that are presented at the outset of the licensing process with clear narratives supporting means of compliance lead to faster determinations. Further, it is important that applicants minimize amendments and changes in the application under review, as these changes often have a broad ripple effect and slow the pace of determinations. Thanks to recent support from Congress, we have been able to increase our staff size, which has allowed us to address some of the growing demands that we're facing as we've seen industry operations grow more than 900% in the last decade. In closing, I'd like to speak briefly about our streamlined launch and reentry requirements regulation. The Part 450 rule, which was published in March 2021, is performance-based and fosters flexibility, efficiency, and innovation while maintaining safety. By March 2026, all licenses must be issued under Part 450. We strongly encourage the industry to submit their Part 450 applications and not wait until the 11th hour. It is my strong belief and conviction that Part 450 will move us in the right direction towards efficiency for both the government and industry, will contribute to safety, and will open the door to greater innovation. Thank you again for the opportunity to discuss this important topic today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. I'd now like to recognize Mr. Cavosa for 5 minutes to present his testimony.
Thank you, Chairman Babin, Chairman Lucas, Ranking Member Sorensen, Ranking Member Lofgren, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. Thank you for inviting me to testify today on behalf of the Commercial Spaceflight Federation and our 80-plus member companies. I'm honored to share our members' experiences and concerns with the FAA's implementation of its Part 450 launch and reentry regulations, which without change could substantially reduce the pace of innovation and impede national competitiveness with China. Industry shares FAA's absolute commitment to protecting public safety, and it's proud of our perfect public safety record to date, as noted by Mr. Coleman. Today, the U.S. commercial spaceflight industry leads the world with a commercial launch every roughly 2.5 days, and that cadence continues to increase. As noted by Mr. Coleman, the volume of U.S. license launches has increased dramatically and will continue to increase as the space industry continues to rapidly mature. It is for this reason why we are so concerned with where we are today with the current implementation of 450. 450 was originally intended to streamline launch and reentry licensing processes, provide a performance-based regulatory framework, and allow for multi-mission licenses. However, the way it is being implemented today has caused severe licensing delays, confusion, and is jeopardizing our long-held leadership position. The current licensing process is costing our member companies millions of dollars for each mission, and when combined with uncertainty and schedule delays, is crippling our efforts to launch and re-enter new vehicles, support new customers, and raise new capital. For instance, an investor question our members often hear these days when raising money is, how are you handling the FAA licensing process? Here are just two examples of the many challenges we're facing. Number one, the pre-application process, or as industry refers to it, playing a game of bring me a rock. Companies get stuck in an endless back and forth process as they discuss means of compliance approval without guidance on what the FAA is actually looking for. This process is taking years. AST number 2 has made it clear in its own statements that industry will need additional guidance via advisory circulars to effectively implement Part 450. 4 years after debuting Part 450, many of these expected advisory circulars are still missing and are needed greatly. And I won't even get into the challenges associated with trying to re-enter vehicles right now. These are just a few of the 6 major challenges I've laid out in my written testimony. We greatly appreciate the hard work of Calvin and the FAA's dedicated staff. I think they're doing their best today to keep the licensing system semi-functional. But if we keep up this pace, the consequences for our nation's leadership role in space are dire. China is watching our regulatory processes and choke points and red tape, and they're smiling. Their governance system is set up with the goal of beating the U.S. in the current space race. Don't get me wrong, we are not here to say get rid of Part 450 or launch licensing and regulation. However, the implementation challenges with 450 do not benefit public safety and are actively hurting our industry. Thankfully, many of the changes that need to be made can be put in place today by AST, concrete and actionable. For example, reinstating the independent technical authority, issuing internal guidance that puts guardrails around the endless pre-application process review, publishing additional advisory circulars that we're asking for. I have a much longer list in my written testimony, but hopefully that gives you a sense of some of the common sense fixes that could be done today. Longer-term fixes are also critical, like the Part 450 Spark, and finally deploying the license application LEAP tracking tool. From Congress, we recommend setting a statutory timeline for approving an applicant's means of compliance, continuing to provide additional resources to AST for Part 450 launch and reentry licensing, and advancing pertinent sections of the Commercial Space Act of 2023, such as the learning period extension, launch and reentry, indemnification and liability extensions, and the launch and reentry streamlining provisions wisely put forward by Representatives Garcia and Stevens and approved by the committee. I thank the subcommittee for the time and look forward to any questions and conversation.
Thank you, Mr. French. Now, I'd like to, thank you, Mr. Gavosa. I'd like to recognize Mr. French for 5 minutes to present his testimony.
Thank you, Chairman Babin.
Yes, sir.
Chairman Lucas, Ranking Member Lofgren, Ranking Member Sorensen, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I serve as the Vice Chair of the FAA's Advisory Committee, ComStack, and my testimony today will reflect my personal assessment of the activities from that committee, as well as my activity in the space community at large. I want to leave you with 3 main points today: around safety and growth, around resources, and around current regulatory challenges. I'll start with safety and growth. The space industry, the launch industry in particular, has seen tremendous growth over the last decade. There's been an over 1,500% increase in the number of licensed launches, over $28 billion invested in the U.S. space industry, and the development and establishment of several new companies and multiple launch vehicles. Throughout this tremendous growth, the U.S. has maintained a 100% public safety record. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't have incidents, and some of them are quite spectacular, and some of them may seem dangerous to the public. But those incidences are not evidence of a regulatory problem, just the opposite. They evidence the success of the regulations in keeping the public safe, which is their purpose. And for that, Mr. Coleman and the AST team really deserve recognition. And that takes me to my second point, which is resources. This growth is not without consequences. While we've seen that tremendous growth in the launch industry, AST's budget has only grown at 10% of the rate of that launch increase. AST's staffing has only grown at 5% of the growth of that licensing increase. And this has created a real burden on the licensing process. Today, AST has to prioritize among active applications, and it is impacting not just the licensing process that's active, but also the development of new guidance and the development of new tools that could help the process writ large. From a CommStack perspective, AST's funding has been a concern for several years now. From a congressional perspective, Congress should be commended for the actions that have been taken this year at the House and Senate Appropriations Committee, with marks that support AST's full requests, including a significant increase for licensing staff. This takes me to my third point, which is regulatory challenges with the implementation of Part 450. The safety record we just talked about, that has primarily taken place under the old set of regulations, or the legacy regulations. This is being replaced by the framework of the Part 450 regulations that we've been talking about today. These challenges have been a significant concern to the CommStack and CommStack membership. Over the last 2 years, we've set several recommendations to AST on this, including a detailed set of recommendations last year providing changes in the implementation process and some of the regulations at a specific regulatory level. I'll highlight 3 areas in particular for these concerns where I think Congress can help out. The first one, what was mentioned before, is the 180-day shot clock, if you would, on the time to complete a regulation. Under the Part 450 framework, the 180-day framework has lost some of its effectiveness, with significant time being spent in what's called pre-application before the clock starts running. I propose that Congress should keep the time limit, but think of a new clock, what I'll call a chess clock instead of a shot clock. Under this system, the clock will start when the pre-application process begins, but then it will run depending on who has possession of the application as it goes through the process. This type of chess clock, matched with the transparency tools that are in development, should provide more transparency to both applicants, AST, and to the Congress, and give a much clearer and more accurate picture of what's going on throughout the process. A second area we've heard concern is on advisory circulars. These are FAA-produced documents that provide a means of compliance to the new regulations. As operators and AST have been contending on how to meet the new regulations, this has increased the importance of these advisory circulars. However, developing new advisory circulars suffers from the same resource problem we talked about before, where the same staff that is responsible for licensing also is needed to complete the advisory circular, creating a bottleneck to choose to solve the problem today or help solve the problem tomorrow. Congress here has the opportunity to help out as well. If we think about those legacy regulations, which is responsible for that safety record that we talked about, Congress could consider allowing operators to use the legacy regulations in those areas where advisory circulars are still under development and give time for the FAA to then provide that guidance under the 450 framework. A third area of concern where Congress can take action is what Mr. Cavosa mentioned in multiple or duplicative safety analysis being provided by AST and by the ranges. In this area, Congress could take action to allow operators to choose whether the AST or the ranges activity analysis to meet the regulations. Finally, I'll end with a possible growing area of concern, which is an environmental regulatory framework. FAA launch licenses are subject to NEPA review. With the growing number of launches, the growing number of launch locations, there's the potential to see a lot more activity and challenges to the FAA environmental review process that occurs in other sectors, but space has generally been left out of. With this, it's another area of further exploration from Congress. And so with my comments on safety and growth, additional resources, and these regulatory fixes, I thank the subcommittee for the time today and the opportunity to testify. Thank you.
Thank you. I now recognize Ms. Meredith for 5 minutes to present her testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Chairman Lucas and members of the subcommittee. Today's hearing ties directly into the FAA's licensing mandate, which is for space launches to promote the commercial space transportation industry while keeping the public safe. Lo and behold, the FAA has succeeded in this. We have a thriving launch industry, and we have had no major safety events affecting the public. Now, that said, there are challenges in the licensing regime, and these relate specifically to Part 450 of the FAA's regulations, which has been mentioned here earlier. Part 450, of course, was intended to streamline and simplify. In practice, it has not done that. It is a maze, complex to navigate, complex to understand, and hard to comply with. It hampers an industry that is ready to move faster. Now, let me give some examples. Some have been provided already today. We've talked about performance-based requirements, and there are also flexibility options, such as showing equivalent level of safety for applicants that can't comply with the FAA's requirements. Now, that sounds helpful and simple, but in practice, this is a two-edged sword. It's flexible because it gives the applicant an opportunity to pick a mode of operation or a method of compliance, yet it takes time for the FAA to evaluate, and it often requires a one-off evaluation which consumes resources. Now, there are mitigating measures for this, additional guidance to industry in the form of advisory circulars, which has been mentioned here earlier, creating a database of safety evaluations of interest across the board, and potentially putting time limits on the FAA's evaluations of various modes of compliance or equivalent safety evaluations. These are things to consider. The 180-day statutory review period is also a concern, not in and of itself, but the problem, as Mr. French mentioned, is that it doesn't begin to run before the applicant is through a complex and lengthy pre-application consultation. Add to that the practice of tolling, whereby the FAA can stop the clock in the middle of the review process to ask for additional information, documentation, and analysis. That is also a concern. So as you can see, we have a licensing regime with lack of certainty, lack of transparency, and significant delay. Now, granted, it isn't easy to regulate this industry. It is an awesome responsibility, and the industry is growing fast and is diverse. And perhaps it's too much to ask the FAA to do better. But I think there are things that can be done even in a constrained resource environment. For example, should resources within the FAA be allocated and prioritized for certain type of applications? I asked the question, for example, should launches with a mission that serve a compelling national interest or a national security interest take priority in the licensing process? Should pending application take priority in the license application over new pre-application consultations? Should payload reviews for existing license application take priority over new payload reviews? And here is one thing the FAA definitely, or the AST specifically definitely should do, and that is to focus its resources on matters strictly within its jurisdiction. Now, all of this is all the more pressing with the looming deadline for the transition to Part 450 for all licenses and new license applications, which must happen before March 10, 2026. And that must happen without disruption or interruption to current launch operations to keep the industry thriving and robust as it is. Thank you, and I'm happy to answer questions. I have written testimony, of course, that has details for all
Yes,
of this.
ma'am. Thank you for your testimony. Before I begin my questions, I'd like to enter into a record, into the record, a letter from SpaceX. So without objection, so ordered. I want to thank the witnesses for your testimony, very valuable, and we really appreciate you folks coming to this morning. And the chair recognizes himself for 5 minutes for questions. And Mr. Cavosa, China is racing to land humans on the moon before us and is on track to do so by 2030. Can you speak to how red tape is impacting commercial space operators and more broadly progress towards American goals for space exploration?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the question. I think there was a few things you said in your opening remarks that I wrote down that made a lot of sense to me. It was this concept of a red moon and red tape, and that's stuck in my head because that's something that we're concerned about. We're concerned that the licensing process right now, the implementation and management of the licensing process is creating drag on the industry and its innovation. Anything that we need to put in space today, whether it's a national security, a civil space mission, human space flight mission, remote sensing, all has to be launched on one of our member companies' rockets. And we're slowing that process down, whereas the Chinese are very much focused on enabling their industry to move as quickly as possible without regard for safety. We don't want to throw out public safety. We are very happy with the public safety record of this industry to date. We want to make sure that the implementation of 450 doesn't continue to slow this industry's innovation down. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Coleman, outside of FAA, other entities within the federal government have expertise in space operations, including NASA and Department of Defense. How is FAA leveraging existing practices of other agencies or operations which have already been reviewed and approved by another government agency so we can expedite application processing?
Chair Babin, thank you for the question. We will certainly accept analyses and work that has been done by other federal agencies if those analyses and that work meets our requirements. We allow launch service providers who are conducting launches from the federal ranges to leverage the ranges services to conduct those analyses. And so as long as those analyses meet our regulatory requirements, we will absolutely accept those analyses. Now, there are some circumstances in which the federal ranges are working in sort of different capacities with companies. For example, the Space Force 45 is working with SpaceX at Boca Chica in a different capacity than it does for launches that take place from the range itself. They're working in more of a contractor capacity with the launch service provider, and which is a little bit different than the way they work when the launch is occurring from the federal range itself.
Thank you. And also, to follow up, you stated in your testimony, Mr. Coleman, that over the last 11 years, FAA has issued 49 license determinations, averaging 151 days to issue a new license. Does that 151 days include time spent in the pre-application process before FAA accepts the application as complete enough? From the testimony I've heard, I think I know the answer, but please.
Yeah, the 150 days is the time that it takes from the clock starting to the determination being made. I will mention on the pre-application consultation, I think there's a little bit of a misconception about what pre-application consultation is and what constitutes pre-application consultation. In simple terms, it is a conversation between the regulator and the launch service provider where we exchange, from the launch service provider's standpoint, what the concept of operations is, what their operations are, where would they occur, et cetera. We share what the regulations require, what we're looking for in terms of compliance, et cetera. Once the applicant provides an application to us, we're no longer in pre-application consultation. We are in a period where we are now assessing whether that application is acceptable or not. Under Part 450, applicants are required to provide means of compliance. This is work that they have to do to show us how they will comply.
Well, if the average time for a new license, what is the average time for a new license if you account for this pre-application process?
Well, I don't have that information and data to account for pre-application consultation, but 151 days is the average time it takes us to conduct a determination.
But that
for a
does not
license.
include the pre-application process. Okay, Ms. Meredith, I have one more question here. This committee passed the Commercial Space Act last November to ensure continued compliance with our international obligations in the least burdensome way possible. At the same time, the administration proposed an approach that would grant several agencies broad and sweeping authority to not only maintain treaty compliance, but also to regulate anything in the national interest, quote unquote, which they alone would determine. Can you comment on how the administration's proposal would affect international competitiveness as well as our nation's ability to explore space?
Yeah. I hadn't specifically looked at the administration's proposal for this, but I think a general complaint with that sort of legislation is that, or proposed legislation, is that it's overbroad and difficult to pass because it is overbroad. So I think that's one of the concerns with that legislation. Also, bifurcating the licensing authority may not be the best approach. That was another thought I had about that legislation, or proposed legislation. Yeah.
My time's expired, so I'm going to go to the ranking member, Mr. Sorensen.
Thank you, Chairman. And to you, Mr. Coleman, it's clear that you and the FAA are doing an outstanding job at ensuring public safety. So many thanks. It's also clear that transitioning to new Part 450 regulations, while also responding to the increasing pace of launch activity, is an increasing challenge. With all of the potential steps and solutions being proposed in this hearing, do you believe that March 2026 is realistic, or that we need to look at a later time frame?
Thank you for the question, Ranking Member Sorensen. I will say that March 2026 at the moment looks very challenging. We have, as was mentioned, we have 6 licenses out of about 30 that have been transitioned to Part 450. To get those additional licenses under Part 450 in that time frame will be very challenging, and we'll keep a close eye on how we are progressing towards that mark in 2026.
Recognizing your office's growing workload, Congress has increased appropriations to help the FAA meet its demands for licensing services. A significant portion of the additional funding is for staff, especially as you compete with the private sector. Are we doing enough to make sure that you can meet those demands?
Well, certainly we appreciate what Congress has done to support our staff increases. We're now currently at 158 persons, which is the largest we've ever been. We've brought on about 35 new persons in the last year as a result of funding that we've received from Congress. But in the President's budget request for 25, we are looking for additional staffing that we will need to continue to keep pace with the demand for our products and services that we're seeing.
And are we going to not only meet that demand here, but are we going to meet the demand when we are competing against China?
Well, listen, we certainly understand and appreciate the importance of beating China to the moon. We just had a conversation recently with NASA leadership where that was reemphasized, and our commitment certainly is to support this industry and our nation in getting to the moon before China. So we will do everything in our power to make sure that that happens.
Mr. French, you noted that the advisory committee that you help lead will be looking at workforce issues of FAA's Office of Commercial Space Transportation. When will that effort be completed, and do you anticipate additional authorities will be needed to support the staffing and workforce needs?
Thank you, Ranking Member Sorensen. We'll be talking about this actually next week at our public meeting, and then that'll likely sort of lead to some discussion with AST. We want to certainly get their feedback on how they think particular authorities could be useful to them. But I'll certainly put that together and provide it to the committee. Any takeaways from there?
Thank you, appreciate that. And Mr. Coleman, as a meteorologist myself, someone who believes that we should be good stewards of the environment that we have been given. Environmental impacts have to be considered as we increase the launch frequency. As the cadence increases, what does the FAA need to do to help meet and assess environmental challenges?
Well, as you mentioned, environmental is very important. As we go through our campaigns to issue licenses, licensing being a major federal action, we have to comply with NEPA. And in doing so, we look at the potential impacts of these operations on the environment. We're looking at a couple of environmental reviews right now in Boca Chica and Boson, Florida. Due to increased operations in Boca Chica, we're looking at the impact on the environment due to those increased operations. We work very closely with our partners in the Fish and Wildlife Service, the fisheries, and other agencies within the Department of Interior to make sure that we have the appropriate mitigations in place when necessary to address environmental needs associated with these licensing activities.
Thank you, Mr. Coleman. And Mr. French, in your opening statement, you talked about environmental challenges. How are we able to meet the need while continuing to progress forward in this sphere?
Yeah, in my perspective, I'm concerned that this could be sort of a new emerging area in the licensing process. I think a lot more attention is being paid to the space industry, and as a result, I think a lot more attention will be paid to the environmental aspects of the space industry. From a congressional perspective, Congress is doing quite a bit of thinking right now on the federal permitting process as it relates to renewable energy. I think it'd be appropriate to look at what's being considered in that area and see if some of those same changes would be appropriate for a space perspective.
Thank you, Mr. French. My time has expired. I yield back.
Sir, thank you. And now I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Posey.
Thank you very much, Chairman Babin. Mr. Coleman, what is the budget amount for the application process, department or division or whatever you call it?
In fiscal year, first of all, thank you for the question, Mr. Posey. The fiscal year 24 budget for my office was $42 million in operations funding.
Okay. How many employees do we have in that department?
We currently have 158 staff members in our organization, with roughly 65 to 70% of those employees working licensing.
Okay. How many licenses do you have in process right now?
I'll have to go back and take a look at the exact number, Mr. Posey, and get back to you on that, but I can tell you.
Just swag it. I'm not going to hold you to it.
Somewhere probably 30 to 40.
Okay. And the average time when the process starts, discounting any stoppage in the middle, is 151 days.
Correct, on the average.
Are you familiar with starfighters?
Yes, of course.
Can you bring me up to date on the status of starfighters?
Well, I know that's a very important topic to you. That was something that the agencies looked at. I think there was legislation passed a couple of years ago that would allow us to take a look at how we might be able to leverage that technology to support the commercial space industry, particularly in the area of commercial human space flight. And there's probably some more details that I could probably collect for you. I'll have to get back to you on additional details.
Okay, well, let me bring you up to date. Starfighters, they fly F-104 jets. Retired pilots, thousands of hours aggregate in experience. Safety record, impeccable. They have flown, I know they did it before I came to Congress, so I assume for decades, they've been licensed or used by NASA to do parabolic missions. You know, it's so much easier to strap an experiment in the back seat of an F-104 and take it up and do your gravitational parabolic test. And so inevitably, somebody's going to say, hey, would you take me for a ride? Well, they have to have a license to do that. They can probably get a license to do that easily in any other country in the entire world. But they went through the process and they applied for a license before I came to Congress 16 years ago. 16 years ago. Now, you had licensed zero gravity to take dozens of people up in a big airplane and let them experience weightlessness. I've had a couple of meetings with your agency, and I can't for the life of me understand why in the world, in over 16 years, they can't get a license. Now, I know you don't want hobbyists taking people up, you know, and you want it regulated. And the excuse I'm always given is, well, they're not an airliner like goes back and forth from DC to Orlando 50 times a day, and they're not an inexperienced, totally novice, like a launch, human launch license you issued over 16 years ago to a company who had never even flown a cargo mission. You gave them a license to launch human beings. They just want to, they're in the middle, and so you can't make a decision on that. That's why I passed, specifically why we passed the legislation that you are aware of, is so that you could license people to do that. And I just would like to know the reason why, beside arrogance, petulance, and defiance, it hasn't been done yet.
Well, Mr. Posey, I certainly appreciate and understand your frustration. I really do. I will tell you, you asked me about the number of applications that are currently on the slate for my organization. Starfighters currently is not one of them. Now, the legislation that was passed, best of my knowledge, was put those responsibilities for looking at starfighters in another part of our agency under Title 49. We're a Title 51 organization. And so I will certainly take your concerns back to the agency. I will talk to my colleagues about that, and we will certainly circle back with you with a more detailed explanation to address your concerns.
Yeah, I know starfighters have it. They're working with George Neal, and they're happy with the licenses that they're getting. This is more a personal oversight perspective for me than it is starfighters, and I really would appreciate it if you would get back to me on that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I see my time is about
Will do, sir.
expired. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Posey. I'd like to recognize the ranking member, Ms. Lofgren.
Thank you. This has been a very interesting hearing, and I've learned a lot, and we've heard some good suggestions. Mr. French, I was intrigued by your chess clock suggestion. I think that's something we ought to take a look at. And the idea of prioritizing, Ms. Meredith, that you mentioned, obviously is something that needs to be looked at in terms of national security issues. But I also, join many of the members not only in supporting the commercial space industry. I want to see it continue to sustain its growth, but we have to make sure that that's done responsibly and not at the detriment of the environment. I understand, for example, that SpaceX has launch applications pending at Boca Chica. You mentioned that, Mr. Coleman, as well as 2 applications to launch heavy rockets from Cape Canaveral and Kennedy Space Center, and that you're reviewing those. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it's my understanding that SpaceX launched at least 1 rocket in Boca Chica without a permit, and that it experienced a major rocket explosions and mishaps, and that it has been cited by Texas environmental authorities for illegal discharge of launch wastewater containing many pollutants, which shows that although we don't like red tape, there may be there's environmental reasons behind taking a look at these launches. Now, we are in a competition with China, but I would note that the Chinese government hasn't shown much concern about polluting their air and water and poisoning the Chinese people in any sense, we care more about the American people than they care about the Chinese people. So here's the question. The costs of environmental damage are really hard to reverse, and I'm wondering, Mr. Coleman, can you explain to us what processes the FAA is going to undertake in its environmental reviews to prevent that kind of problem? And since I'm asking you this question, I've been thinking about the resource issue. And there are other entities in government that augment their funding, and in some cases are entirely funded by fees. For example, the Patent Office is entirely funded by fees. Obviously, SpaceX is owned by the richest man in the world, so there is some opportunity for increased fees to help augment the budget. I don't know if it's fair to ask you to comment on that idea. So those are the two questions to you, Mr. Coleman.
Yeah, thank you, Ranking Member Lofgren. On the environmental front, as you mentioned, the environmental issues are of significant concern. The processes that we follow is that we, when there is an action that we are considering to license, for example, again, I'll use Boca Chica for an example. SpaceX is now contemplating increasing the number of launches from that site. And so what we have initiated is, first of all, we've initiated a draft environmental assessment that contains our assessment of what those environmental impacts would be. We've released that document to the public for public consumption, and we've also called for public meetings to bring the public into the conversation to discuss those potential impacts and what we should be considering to address those impacts.
And do you also include, for example, in this case, they've been cited, I guess, by the Texas environmental agencies for polluting the water.
Yeah.
Do you reach out to the state environmental agencies to get their feedback as well, proactively?
Absolutely. We have talked to Texas CEQ. We've also talked to the EPA about those violations to get their concerns. We've also updated our draft environmental assessment to account for those violations that you just mentioned.
It's unfair to ask you about the fee issue because that's not something you can probably ask, but it would be helpful for the committee to know what dollar amount would be required for you to staff up to the point where you could get these applications reviewed in the time frame that we would all like, but you know, to do it, to get the job done fully, not to make shortcuts. What would that be? And then we can take a look at how we might address that outside of the appropriations process. Could you do that after this hearing?
Sure, I'd be happy to talk.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Yes, ma'am, thank you. Before we go to the next questions, I know we've got some folks from Johnson Space Center sitting here. I wanted to recognize them. Raise your hands if you're from Johnson Space Center. About half the room. Thank you all for being here. That's right. I'm very proud to be representing you all. Thank you. Hope you enjoy your tour. Happened to be from my district, Mr. Posey. Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, I'd like to recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Garcia, for his questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess the bulk of my 5 minutes will be observations and statements as a former, senior program director for an aerospace company that's been through some of this. Mr. Coleman, I guess the first question, though, is you acknowledge that we are in a space race with China, right? This isn't something that you don't agree with. You acknowledge that in order for us to be competitive with China in this race, that we do need the commercial partners, and we do need to enable the commercial partners to do their jobs effectively. And obviously, safety is a key performance parameter in all of these programs, but time is also a KPP and something that we value as much as safety. Would you acknowledge that as well?
Our fundamental focus is on public safety, national security, and foreign policy interests, and we look to make determinations as expediently as we can recognizing that launch is important to our national security interests and our foreign policy interests. And as you mentioned, Congressman Garcia, we do recognize the importance of making expedient determinations as we look to get to the moon as soon as we can by March 2026.
Yeah, it's not just important, though. It's required by law. Under Part 450, you have an obligation to complete the application processes within 180 days. So my understanding is that to date, we have yet to actually complete a Part 450 application within 180 days. So I think from my observations as a former program director, I see that you've adopted effectively a zero risk mentality, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but when you do that while also not opening the aperture to ideas which Mr. French and Ms. Meredith outlined in terms of ways to go faster, ways to prioritize in the rack and stack some of these more important national security initiatives. In accepting that zero risk mentality, you also accept and in part a zero success mentality and a zero responsiveness mentality, what I would call a zero customer service mentality and a zero closed feedback loop mentality with our commercial partners. And you're actively disincentivizing them from participating in this very important national security endeavor and science endeavor as well. So when it comes to this issue with the clock, I am reluctant to call it a chess clock because a chess clock measures cumulative time. And that's effectively what we have right now with the 180-day requirement. I think we do need a shot clock because what's happening is you're sitting on documents from the commercial partners and waiting 30 days to get questions back to them or responses back to them, and it's when you go back to industry for answers, they respond within 24 or 48 hours, and then they give the responses back, and it's like a black hole. I'll look at Starship 5 license approval, which you had initially promised would be issued by September 17th. It then took about a week ago a shift of about 2 months to November 22nd, and then yesterday, you shifted the overall readiness date to November 26th, and for this license modification, you're already just now 3 days away from violating the 180-day shot clock requirement. We've heard from companies in my district, around my district, that are literally spending 10% of their top-line revenue on this application process and in the delays imparted by AST. So, I'm looking for answers here. I think you've got the wrong paradigm right now, and I understand the root cause and the head count and the funding is an issue. But as your appropriator and as your authorizer, we fully funded your request. So the question is, what is the right? By the way, I don't like doing things outside the Appropriations Committee when it comes to funding. I think that's very dangerous. What is the appropriate amount? What is the head count needed to successfully adjudicate and approve Part 450 licenses by the time that is required, 180 days by the date of 2026, where all licenses will be needed under that construct? What is the right amount? Because if you can't execute it, I would submit it shouldn't be under FAA's domain. It shouldn't be under AST. We can find other places like AFRL, DARPA, other go-fast agencies to man this and do it correctly. But what is the right funding level that you need to do your job successfully, which we have not been doing?
Thank you for the question, Congressman Garcia. A couple points I want to make. Number one, we have issued 6 licenses under Part 450. Only on one occasion have we taken more than 180 days to make that determination. Only on one occasion.
If I may, Mr. Chairman, that is contrary to the testimony by Mr. Cavosa. His written testimony suggests that you have not made that commitment.
Well, I'm the regulator. Mr. Cavosa is not. I can tell you that we've made that determination on every occasion except for one. Now, Mr. Cavosa can have his own opinion, but I have the record, and I'm the regulator for that. Now, to your question about how much resource does it take, the President in the 25 requests has requested a discretionary increase for our office up to $57 million in operations. That's the largest discretionary increase that our office will ever have received. and hopefully that we'll get that in '25. We currently have 158 staff.
Is that the right answer, though? It's the biggest number, but is it the right answer to actually execute Part 450 correctly?
Part 450 execution is dependent on a number of factors. Number one is having the appropriate resources that we need to execute it. Also, as I mentioned in my opening statement, industry can take responsibility and accountability as well by coming into us with applications that speak to the requirements, that are robust, that are thorough, such that we don't have to have multiple iterations and go-backs with industry. That takes up time, that takes up resource.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm out of time.
Thank you, Mr. Garcia. And the gentlewoman from Virginia, Ms. McClellan.
Thank you, Chairman Babbitt and Ranking Member Sorensen, for this important hearing. This is a particularly relevant issue for Virginia. As you know, we are home to the Mid-Atlantic Regional Spaceport at Wallops Island, which is one of only 4 spaceports in the United States that is licensed by the FAA for vertical launches to orbit. And it is critical that not only to spaceflight, but to the robust operation of that facility and all of the infrastructure that supports it, it's critical that our regulatory frameworks not only work, but protect humans engaging in spaceflight and the communities across the country that support those operations while allowing the United States to maintain its leadership in space. And so, Mr. Coleman, as you know, the Memorandum of Agreement for range coordination between NASA and the FAA is important for launch operators to have clarity about their licensing responsibilities, especially around ground safety and flight safety. Can you provide an update on the status of this Memorandum of Agreement?
Certainly, thank you, Congresswoman. Absolutely. And first of all, these memorandums of agreement are very important. As was mentioned earlier, Space Policy Directive 2 directed federal agencies such as the Department of Transportation, the Space Force, as well as NASA to minimize duplication of effort and to streamline our concerted efforts to oversee and work with this industry. We are working on a memorandum of understanding or agreement with NASA right now. It is being drafted. We are pushing hard on that. We certainly want to see that such that we can have clear understanding and delineation of roles and responsibilities for launch service providers that are conducting operations at NASA ranges, such as the NASA Wallops in Virginia. We have responsibility for public safety, not only for public not involved, but for the public that's present on the facility itself, even NASA employees. Right. And so we're carving that agreement out. We're pushing forward. It is very important for the progress of operations that are being contemplated at the facility that you asked about.
Thank you. And can you tell us what steps the FAA is taking to support a cadence of regularly scheduled commercial space launches at Wallops?
Well, first of all, I think Wallops is an excellent facility. I was just there a couple of weeks ago, had an opportunity to meet with leadership there and talk about just what you're asking about, how we can work with the leadership there to increase the cadence of commercial activities there. We're also working with the Mid-Atlantic Regional Spaceport there. They have outstanding leadership. General Ted Mercer, who leads that organization, is doing an outstanding job of pushing for more commercial operations at that site. We're working with the companies, such as Rocket Lab, for example, to ensure that we are licensing their activities in a timely enough fashion, supporting what they're looking to do, such that there can be more commercial activities from that facility.
Thank you. And Mr. Cavosa, can you, one of the things I like to do when I'm back in the district is help to connect the work that we're doing here in Washington and specifically on this committee with what's happening in their lives. And while Wallops is not in the 4th District, commercial spaceflight does have an impact. So can you describe the impacts that the launch and re-entry regulations would have on the everyday lives of not only my constituents, but people around the country that don't have these facilities in their districts?
Sure, thank you for the question. Sort of noted earlier, but everything that makes up the commercial space industry today whether it's satellite communications, GPS, national security, human space flight, remote sensing, Earth observation, environmental data we're receiving today. All of it is being launched into space through our member companies from these spaceports around the country as well. And licensing slows the process down for new entrants as well, for competition, for new launch vehicles. The drag I referred to before of licensing could potentially have a dramatic impact on new launch vehicles entering the marketplace, new players entering the marketplace, new companies getting funding to enter the marketplace, and that affects the commercial space industry and all of the benefits that we provide the United States and your constituents.
Thank you. Ms. Chair, you're back.
Thank you, ma'am. I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Georgia, Dr. McCormick.
Would you mind, Mr. Strong?
Okay, Mr. Strong, you'll go next then.
Thank you, sir.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman Babin, Ranking Member Sorensen. Companies in North Alabama rely on clear and consistent FAA regulations to deliver space-based capabilities for their customers. Mr. Coleman, I'd like to know how your office plans to keep pace with the increased cadence and complexity of commercial space transportation operations. You testified earlier that you have roughly 30 to 40 active applications currently pending under the Part 450.
Thank you for the question, Congressman. It is certainly a challenge to keep pace with the demand that we're seeing. Number one, we went on a very aggressive campaign this past year to hire additional staff that we needed in technical areas that serve the licensing process, bringing on more flight safety analysts, more system safety analysts, more engineers to support the work that we're doing. We're in a fierce competition for those resources with NASA and DOD, as well as the companies that we regulate. Flight safety analysts, for example, is a skill set that you don't necessarily learn in school. You learn it through experience, and so we are in a fierce competition to bring those resources on. That's number one, the resource piece. Number two, we are trying to work with industry to the extent that we can to help industry understand what needs to be done in order to demonstrate compliance with Part 450. We've issued 17 advisory circulars last year. We're on pace to issue up to 10 this year. And hopefully those advisory circulars will serve as tutorials that will help the industry better understand what compliance for 450 looks like.
Thank you. To what extent is license prioritization, affected by whether the application is within the 180-day evaluation stage?
If I understand the question, Congressman, prioritization really has to do, well, let me say this first of all. 10 years ago, we weren't even talking about prioritization. Prioritization has only come into play as the amount of work that we are faced with is being challenged by the availability of resources that we have to do that work. We certainly take a look at national security concerns. We take a look at our civil space exploration concerns. And we certainly put those concerns at the very top of the heap when considering having to make choices in terms of what work gets done and when it gets done.
Thank you. Once a site or a vehicle operator enters the 100-day evaluation stage, are they allowed to make modifications to their license?
They are, and they have. It was mentioned by Ms. Meredith that we, from time to time, stop the clock. We call that tolling. That gives the applicant an opportunity to correct an error or to provide missing information that if it weren't presented, we would wind up with a denial of the application. We are giving the applicant an opportunity to fix it and to demonstrate compliance. So tolling is a positive thing that we leverage during the 180-day clock to give the applicant an opportunity to get to a yes answer.
Thank you. Associate Administrator, I understand that your office has not yet gone back to 100% return to work policy. Given the increased demands for Part 450 licenses, what operational and day-to-day procedural changes can your office make to manage the demand? We're going to the moon and we're going to Mars, and we've got to get to work.
Absolutely. I agree with you 100%. We have a dedicated professional team that's hardworking. They are working full-time. They have all returned to work. They all are working full-time. However, as most federal agencies are faced with challenges in the aftermath of the pandemic, we have, of course, have some situations where we don't have everyone in the office every day. We have remote work from time to time. We have people who work from home and telework. But with that being the case, we are managing the productivity of our staff and ensuring that we are getting full productivity from our staff in the face of a new environment in which we're working.
Thank you. Mr. Coleman, there are companies in my district who have been working to get a reentry license since 2016. I understand that they have met safety calculations. What is preventing Sierra Space from getting a permit to land at the second largest airport in the southeast United States? Do you believe that more than 3,000 days, is that long enough to get a permit?
It certainly should be, but what's important is, what you asked the question, what's keeping them from getting a permit?
Correct.
Demonstration of the requirements. Compliance with the requirements. That's what's keeping them from that. Now, we're working with Sierra Space to help them understand what they need to demonstrate and show insofar as means of compliance is concerned. And we've had a number of conversations with them, and they're making good progress, and we hope to get them licensed soon.
Well, I can tell you this right here, we want to be first. There's no doubt about it. I want to be safe, but I do have concerns. When this application's been active since 2016, it's time to move forward, and I want to do anything I can to help. I'm not sure if additional employees is the solution. I do think that we need to get back to work and put the American space program #1. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much. I'd like to recognize the gentlewoman from Michigan, Ms. Haley Stevens.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Ranking Member, for allowing me to wave onto this committee. Mr. Coleman, you're an associate administrator, and I'm just curious, who do you report to?
The FAA administrator.
Okay, the administrator overall. And I just want to commend you, sir. I really believe that you've had a tremendous career and you are a true steward of the government and public service. And I want to thank you for your dedication to your practice. As I've been listening to today's hearing, what is clear and evident is that we are in a bureaucratic soup by no individual's fault other than the lack of willingness to lead. We as members of Congress can ask all the questions that we are asking and push forward the vision that we want to get to the moon, and that feels good to say, and we want to be first and we want to be ahead. But until we have the strategic coordination of government coming from a pay grade higher than yours, sir, and I appreciate who you report to and the pressure on the FAA overall and what's going on in commercial spacecraft to our commercial aviation industry to small flight craft sectors across this country, frankly, that are training people how to fly, and it's really exciting to see that. But, Mr. Coleman, you announced that AST would establish a aerospace rulemaking committee, or SPARC, regarding Part 450, and this announcement was met with tremendous industry support. However, SPARC has still yet to be established. Moreover, given the average SPARC can take years to produce recommendations, as we've been kind of uncovering here today, I worry that the window to make meaningful impact to Part 450 before the 2026 transition or promulgation of new human spacecraft regulations is quickly closing. So, Mr. Cavosa and Mr. French, in both your testimonies, you state that AST should expeditiously establish SPARC, this group. Can you please explain why this SPARC is so important to resolving Part 450 issues? What are we going to get from that?
Thank you. The SPARC is extremely important long-term solution. As you noted in your question and your statement, it's going to take some time to stand it up and work through these issues and come up with recommendations. So we are very much supportive of a SPARC as soon as possible. But a lot of what we're talking about today, in my testimony in particular, are some near-term, immediate process fixes that the FAA can do. The SPARC is part of the long-term solution. It has to happen, but there's also things that can be done today outside the Spark.
Yeah, and maybe we should send a memo to the White House, right? I mean, let's just get them talking about Spark and this national imperative and the things that we need to do, because I trust the people who go in to work every single day on behalf of this government only have the best interests in mind, but something is stopping this process. And we know we're not getting to the moon unless we have commercial spacecraft. So something's not working here. And I don't know if we're going to solve it in this committee, but we hope that people are hearing us. French, would you like to get in here?
Sure, thank you. The one thing with the Spark is we're currently 2 going on right now. There's one on 440, which is about indemnification insurance regimes, and the other is on the human spaceflight regime. Having served as a member or serving as a member in both those Sparks, what they provide is an environment for companies to provide detailed recommendations outside of sort of the pure public sphere, which I think is able to lead to recommendations that AST can implement sort of more completely.
Okay,
That's
so there's
the
some
benefit.
promise.
Absolutely.
Okay, well, we'll dig on that. And then, Mr. Cavosa, in your testimony, you highlighted the potential benefits of this bipartisan amendment I've been involved in with my colleague, Mr. Garcia. This was offered about a year ago in last fall's markup of the Commercial Space Act of 2023. And the amendment seeks to provide new authorities to FAA, AST to expedite the processes and support industry competitiveness. And Mr. Cavosa, can you just describe why you are supportive of this amendment?
Sure. I mean, everything we've discussed today about the challenges and the drag on the commercial space industry right now are very well addressed by your amendment and by that piece of legislation. So it helps move things forward. It helps focus the FAA, AST office on exactly the issues we think need to be addressed immediately.
Yeah. Well, and just in reflecting in my first term in this committee, we celebrated and acknowledged the 50 years since the moon landing, the first moon landing. And you think back to that amazing history of what it took to get us to the moon. It wasn't this stuff, folks. It wasn't this. And I'm not knocking anybody, because I think you're all professionals and you're all dedicated to your charge. But we cannot look back and say, we were pushing papers and needling and waiting for Spark and 450 and 440 and all these different numbers. We have to set the mission, and it's got to come from the top. And so I'm here to work with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to push that forward and to see us succeed safely, responsibly. We also know some of the pressures that have been going on in FAA outside of commercial, and we can maybe get to that off the record. So with that, Mr. Chair, I'm going to yield back. Thank you for the important hearing.
Thank you very much. I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. McCormick.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate you, and thanks for being here today. Congratulations, by the way. You found something that united the Democrats and Republicans. Unfortunately, it's our dissatisfaction with the FAA and the approval process right now. For the first time in history, at least since maybe the Roman era, where Pompey could raise his own army and buy his consulship, we have civilians outperforming the U.S. government. One person in the United States can put more spaceships into the stratosphere than the entire governments of all the world combined. So if we're going to be competitive, it's not going to be through NASA anymore. It's going to be through our industry. The problem is when you have different programs such as SpaceX, ULA, Blue Origin, and others that have redefined space travel, who just launched the Polaris Dawn this morning and are going to do the first spacewalk with civilians. If we start holding up that process, we lose our edge in this world market that is extremely competitive. We lose against China. We lose against Iran. We lose against Russia. This is our place in history that we are grabbing or losing. Tell me, when we put all these spaceships, more than anybody else in the world, already up there, why the same process that we used to approve that, all of a sudden, has something changed? Is there a reason that we're holding up the same process that's already been approved previously? These 27, I think you said advisories, 17 in 1 year, 10 the next year, that you put out in the last 2 years, how much has that sped up the process? How much have you internally looked at to speed up the process? How have you been accountable for passing the very people, the process of licensing to make us competitive on the world market, which is maybe your most important thing that you do. Please. Yes, Mr. Coleman.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Congressman. Safety is our focus. That's why we're in business.
So real quick, I just want to refocus what you're saying right now. Are you saying that these people that put in their license applications who are already doing what they're doing, and they're asking for exactly what they've already achieved, what you've approved them from the process before, what has changed that's holding them up?
Well,
Not safety.
I'll give you an example.
Good.
Let's take Starship Super Heavy, Boca Chica. We issued a 450 license to SpaceX for that activity. You asked what changes. Missions change. Technologies on the vehicle change, which require a modification to the license. 450 is designed to approve a suite of missions. We should not, well, I shouldn't say we should not. It is our intention with 450 to not have to come back to deal with modifications at such a frequent basis. We're up to the 5th flight now. We have 4 flights. SpaceX has 4 flights under its belt, 3 of which have been under modifications to the license that have been requested by the company. It is the company that is pushing mission by mission approvals. That's what the pace is about.
So you do realize that technology changes literally every day. This is the leading edge technology in the world, whether it be AI, quantum, space exploration. Once again, these are individuals taking their own risk. It's like when we threw our family in the back of a wagon and went west. We might freeze, we may starve, we may be killed, but we're taking a chance for the betterment of our family or our society or our business. That's the American way. Like I said, you talk about safety. I think every company is very much understands that if they're not safe, they go away, they go extinct. They are policing themselves. Who are we to get in the way of progress? I ask you to streamline your process because I think if you don't, we fall behind and our very way of life is in jeopardy. You're in charge. You make the difference. You get to determine how fast these go through. And if what you're doing is not working, you need to change. Does that make sense?
I appreciate the comment, Congressman. We are doing the very best job that we can, as I mentioned in my opening statement, to enable safe space transportation at a pace that meets our needs. But we cannot enable safe space transportation by setting aside demonstration of compliance with the regulatory requirements and safety. That's very important. So I appreciate what you're saying insofar as what our responsibilities are and the powers that we have to make these things happen, and we're doing our level best to do that. We're working with industry to help them better understand what compliance against Part 450 looks like, and hopefully they will take our advice and move in that direction.
So I'll conclude with this, and I'll yield my point, sir. If I thought there's your regulation, which I know you guys are the regulatory bureaucracy, if I thought your regulation was making us safer, I would agree with you. I just haven't seen that traditionally. I've seen a lot of space missions held up because of something that really had nothing to do with safety, just regulation. And regulation is killing American business from top to bottom, not just in this industry, but all across America. And that's what I want to see cut so we can actually make advancements and stay competitive. With that, I yield.
Okay, sir. Now I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Webster.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Coleman, back, I think, in February, AST announced that they wanted to have an advisory group we've been talking about, and that group is going to be appointed to look for changes or get testimony or just check it out and see what changes need to be made. As of yet, that group isn't appointed. Is there some sort of reason behind having not done that?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. I announced in February during our commercial space transportation conference that we would be standing up this aerospace rulemaking committee that you're asking about, and I stated that we would have it in place by the end of summer, by early fall. We still have a few weeks left. It's not quite the end of summer yet. We haven't quite gotten into the fall yet. So I think we're still on schedule. I can tell you that the charter has been drafted. It is being reviewed, and we hope to have it stood up in short order.
So is that timeline still effective and that you'll have it by that deadline?
We're pushing to have it stood up as soon as we can. We're close to getting that approved, and hopefully we'll get that started ASAP.
So also, one of the goals of Part 450 process to allow multiple launches and to get permitting for that. As of yet, there might be some, I don't know, but I don't know of any. Is there some reason why that's not taking place?
I don't know the full reason as to why it's not taking place. Each of the 6 licenses that we've issued for Part 450 have been for individual missions. We would like to see more planning done up front, more methodologies that will cover a broad swath of missions that we can consider. But I think what oftentimes happens is companies are up against a launch date. And with a launch date looming, it becomes the easy solution to say, well, we will dial back our application to a single mission versus a broad suite of missions. And so we've had some companies that have put a number of missions on the table, but as launch dates have approached, those applications have been dialed back to individual missions. I would like to see more utilization of the features that are available in Part 450, which allows us to approve a large suite of missions such that we don't have to have as many modifications and go-backs with companies when they want to change a mission.
Thank you very much. So do you think that's something in the future, that there's going to be multiple launches approved at one time?
I absolutely believe that. I would like to just remind the committee, Part 450 is only 3 years old. This is still a very new regulation. I think 5 years from now and 10 years from now, we will have hit our stride with it. And these conversations will be long in the rearview mirror. But it is a new regulation that we have to get our arms around to a greater extent. The industry has to get its arms around to a greater extent. There's learning all around. We are doing things on our side, like implementing SMS for licensing, where our engineers will have decision trees that they can utilize to figure out, the level of risk that's associated with the review and what decisions they need to make in association with what they're seeing. So we are equipping our organization with the tools that it needs as we continue in our quest to implement Part 450.
Thank you very much. Yield back.
Okay, thank you. Now, the gentleman from California, Mr. Vince Fong.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for letting me waive on to the subcommittee for today's hearing. Just a few questions for Mr. Coleman. I want to delve into the answer to the last question you pointed out, which is one of the goals of the Part 450 process was to allow for multiple launches and reentries under a single license. And as you mentioned before, of the 450 licenses that have been approved, most have been approved for a single launch or a single reentry. How can we facilitate the expansion of that to allow for multiple launches, and what's the hang up?
I think number one, I think most companies that are approaching Part 450 underestimate the work that is required to establish and show and demonstrate means of compliance that are that meet our requirements. This is what is fundamentally different in Part 450. It's performance-based. We set risk criteria that must be met, but we allow companies to come in and show us the how versus us prescribing the how.
So can I delve a little deeper? What's different between the launches? You mentioned, is there something specific that you're looking for each launch that's unique to each one?
You mean what's different in causing us to go from mission?
Yeah,
to mission?
you're saying that that it's delayed because you're asking for the stakeholders to do more. But what is distinctly different from each launch that you're looking for?
Well, for each mission or for a suite of missions, companies have to come in and show us means of compliance. For example, they have to show us flight safety methodology. How are you going to demonstrate that, et cetera. There's a substantial amount of work to be performed in demonstrating that. Also, I think there is a substantial amount of planning that needs to be done, such that companies have an idea that looks far enough in the future or far enough ahead that we can account for under licensing and allow the time it takes for us to work through means of compliance and get those things settled before we turn the clock on.
So understanding that answer, then, the FAA reports that when fully implemented, Part 450 will reduce how often operators must apply for an FAA license. So how do I juxtapose the answer you just gave me to the goal that the FAA is trying to get to, which is that the operators would actually apply less, will reduce how often the operators will apply for a license? Because if you keep asking for the same thing, but the goal is to actually allow the operators a streamlined process to interact and get a broader license authority to do more launches, how does that comport together?
Could you repeat the question for me?
So you're saying that the challenge with multiple launches and multiple entries under a single license is you're requiring more information from the commercial space company, but then the goal is to actually have the operators to reduce how often operators must apply for an FAA license. So if you're going to require all this information for every single launch, but the goal is actually to have them interact with you less, how does that go together?
Well, actually, the goal is when they come to us initially with this information, that this information will cover multiple launches, not a single launch, but multiple launches. And so we're looking to approve methodologies. Once we can approve your methodologies for achieving safety, go off and conduct as many launches as you need to, as long as you're following those methodologies. What we're encountering is we're encountering applications that only address a single mission versus a suite of missions. And so we are looking to get to the solution piece of this. We are looking to push advisory circulars to help companies understand what compliance looks like, what a good methodology looks like, what means of compliance should entail and focus on in order to demonstrate compliance with our regulations.
Okay. And my last question, you mentioned earlier the need to prioritize. And so, and you mentioned national security implications. So when the DoD or NASA or another federal agency says that a launch is a priority for them, how does that in practice happen when you prioritize a launch? And with that, I'll yield back.
Well, we look very carefully at the missions, and we fully support and prioritize missions that support our national security concerns and our civil space exploration needs. Missions that are providing critical cargo to the International Space Station to support our astronauts on the space station, or to deliver crew to the space station are the types of missions that typically we put a lot of focus on, a lot of resources on to ensure that those missions occur.
So do they move to the top of the list if the chair may let me ask that question?
Yeah, if there's a critical need to get food or other materials to the International Space Station to support our astronauts on the space station, absolutely, those missions are pushed to the front.
All right, thank you. Gentlemen's time has expired. We're going to go back through for our second round, and this time we're going to have 2 minutes to get your questions in and answered. And so I will ask the first one, and I'm going to direct this to Mr. Cavosa. Mr. Cavosa, in your opinion, is it currently possible to comply with Part 450 requirements when it's related to reentry? And if no, why?
Well, thank you for the question. It sort of gets into some advanced technical details and conversations here, but As I understand it, when 450 was created, it was very much focused on the launch aspect, and reentry was thrown in. And we tried to develop regulations where both launch and reentry could be handled by the same Part 450. It is much harder, as FAA noted, AST noted in the rule, to comply with the conditional expected casualty calculation if you are reentering from, for some of our vehicles in particular. Some of our vehicles have a very long reentry path when coming from the International Space Station. And the current way 450 is written with this, again, this conditional expected casualty calculation, it is extremely difficult to meet the requirement when we're reentering the way we do.
Thank you very much. I'll yield back, and let's see, we will go to our ranking member, Mr. Sorensen.
I did want to touch a little bit on NASA's decision to return astronauts Butch Wilmore and Suni Williams from the ISS on a Crew Dragon rather than a Boeing Starliner flight test vehicle. I think commendation needs to be presented to NASA and to Boeing for their commitment to prioritizing safety. This has been a riveting space subcommittee hearing, and so if those astronauts Wilmore and Williams are watching, many thanks for their heroic teamwork, their patience, their flexibility on the crew flight test mission as we look forward to their safe return home, and also the sacrifice that their families are making. And I did want to continue the questioning from our chairman to you, Mr. Coleman. You know, as we look forward, as we are learning as we go, how can we make sure that Part 450 can meet the needs for reentry?
Well, that's a great question, Congressman. We are looking at the very issue that was raised there. We understand. Well, let me say this first of all. When we published 450, we knew it was not a perfect rule to start with. We knew that we would find, as we went along in its implementation, that we would find some kinks. And this is one of them that we've uncovered. And so part of the assignment for the Spark that we're going to stand up is to look at the conditional expected casualty requirements and how those apply to reentry vehicles. And so we're looking very much forward to this Spark. We're looking forward to its recommendations, and we look forward to implementing the recommendations and towards making Part 450 a better rule.
Thank you for that. I appreciate the way that you said that this is an assignment. So as Congress goes forward in the next couple of days to concerning a continuing resolution of our funding, how does that impact what we do and meeting our needs to completing the assignment? And I'll open that up to anyone.
You know, I'll jump in here. I think from an AST perspective, any sort of lapse in appropriation or delay in appropriation limits the ability for them to start the hiring process. I think we've talked a lot about today about the broader implications of a space race in our competition. I think from a national security space perspective, you know, any sort of delay in appropriations is probably our #1 self-inflicted wound in our competition and maintaining our lead with our adversaries.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, and I'd like to recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Garcia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, I just want to be very clear, Mr. Coleman, that I don't think any of us are asking you to run with scissors. We're not asking you to make safety not be the #1 priority. But we are asking that you maybe don't adopt a zero-risk mentality, but also recognize that speed is also life, and that every day that we slide these launches or these recoveries is literally impacting and ripples into programs that are extremely important, like Artemis, et cetera. So I think you guys understand that. I'm not sure at the worker level when they're processing these licenses that they truly appreciate the national security implications. You mentioned that companies are trying to make a launch date, and I would submit to you that this country is trying to make the launch dates, and I think that's the paradigm shift that we need. I am not convinced that this is the right agency to be doing this mission. We can take that discussion offline. I will submit for the record a question asking you what your current headcount is dedicated to processing Part 450 licenses, and then what the FY25 requests, and we're almost to FY26 President's budget release as well, so what the headcounts in those budget requests will look like. I will state, though, that you said FY25 request was a record high. It is a record high. It's $57 million. But 10% of that is to fund the orbital human spaceflight and mission authorization scope that you don't currently have authorization for. So about $6 million or so of that is for that. So that is not authorized, and so hopefully you're not banking on the come for that money to solve this problem. I just want to reiterate that we need our commercial partners to do this. I also want to inquire as to whether the FAA administrator, Mr. Whitaker, is aware of these issues with Part 450. Are there program management reviews at the FAA level that rise to his level? And we'll submit more detailed technical questions and program management questions for the record, but would respectfully request timely responses to those if we can. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Fong, do you have any more questions?
Yes, I just have a few more if the chair will indulge me.
Sure,
Just broadly speaking, Mr. Coleman, I mean, do you have a concern that your office's licensing delays are impacting national priorities?
Certainly. We are under constant pressure, increased pressure to meet all of our demands. I'll put it simply, Congressman, we don't have enough resource to keep pace with all of demand that is coming our way simultaneously. And so, yes, we are concerned. We need the resources. We need cooperation and engagement from industry, as I mentioned in my opening statement, to come to us with applications that are thorough and robust at the onset. We don't have the capacity to what I loosely say is handhold with industry to ensure that their applications are complete and that they are good enough to eventually be accepted for licensing. Those days are behind us. So we're going to have to continue to work with industry to help industry better understand what's needed for Part 450 so we can push ahead. And we also need the resources at our disposal to meet demand.
If I could ask the rest of the panel, the three other panelists, to I guess address my original question, which is, if the goal of Part 450 is to allow for multiple launches and reentries, and as Mr. Coleman said, that somehow there's lack of information being provided by the commercial space entities, is that true on your end, and what can be done to streamline that process?
On behalf of the industry, there are very few things in my 20 years in the space industry that have gotten everybody on the same page, and one of them is export controls and the challenges they have on the industry, and the other is the challenges we are having with 450 right now and the conversations and the technical interchange meetings between industry and the FAA during that pre-application process. There definitely seems to be a challenge here with our view of what's going on and the FAA's view of how they're handling it. We don't seem to be on the same page there.
Yeah, I think as far as the multiple license or single license, I think because you have the challenges of meeting the requirements at a single mission basis, it's almost a sort of a step too far to sort of now, hey, let's go tackle the multiple missions, right? So in sort of I think it's sort of an expediency choice, right? If you sort of look at that you need to get a license met, while there's this optimal path of a multi-missions license, there's an expediency route of simply trying to meet the license today. That also, I think, reflects in the growing importance of these advisory circulars, right? Because the advisory circulars were intended to be one means of compliance. But operators are saying, if this is a way we can do it, perhaps it's suboptimal, but we're going to look to that as guidance to expedite things. So I think that's probably why we are where we are in that question.
Well, I ask myself, if a means of compliance or method of compliance is acceptable for one launch, why is it different for several launches? That is not clear to me, unless the several are different from the first, or the next ones are different from the first.
Thank you very much. I yield back.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much. I want to thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony today and the members for their questions. The record will remain open for 10 days for additional comments and written questions from members. And I think this has been a very valuable subcommittee hearing today. So with that, we stand adjourned.